Hey guys, how's it going? Professor Shuckle here, back with another Pokemon Draft League video. This time though, we will be doing something different. Something much different. This is something I've been working on for a while, so hopefully you guys enjoy it. And thus I've decided to share some tips and pointers on how to improve at Pokemon Draft League. And these are pointers I've learned throughout my Draft League career. And I hope that this can be beneficial for people looking to improve their Pokemon. As I firmly believe that everyone should always be hungry to learn and that there's always room for improvement, no matter how good or experienced you are at the game. And just to establish some ground rules, these tips assume people know the basics of draft leagues and competitive Pokemon. So this guide is designed for people who have been playing for at least a little while and want to get better. But obviously it could be beneficial for everybody, hopefully. But before we jump into the guide, why should you listen to me? What do I know, right? Who's this guy? So, to establish some credentials, I've been playing draft since the summer of 2018. I've played over 500 Draft League games over multiple formats: Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, Ultra Sun Ultra Moon, Sword and Shield, and the recently released Scarlet and Violet. I competed in the Draft Premier League, which many believe to be the most competitive tournament, also the most toxic, for the first time in Season 4, and my team ended up winning, which was pretty cool. I was able to contribute to the team with a 5-1 personal record in Sword and Shield, and I got to learn from some really good players like King L5, who was on my team. I also went undefeated in the Swiss bracket for the LD Invitational Tournament, which was the biggest Gen 8 individual tournament held, I believe. And I've also been part of winning teams in other tours like the TDT, PWS, and PGP. I've also won a few leagues in my time. I don't really play anymore, but I did win the Hive Kakuna Season 8 just before DPL Season 4. So fair to say, I've been around a while and definitely learned a lot from a lot of good players, and I just hope to share that knowledge with you. So without much further ado, let's jump into it. Starting up, I'm going to be focused on drafting, which is essentially the starting process of a draft league, right? So my first tip is to emphasize roles and not types while drafting. I'm certain at some point, especially when you're new into draft league scene, everyone was told that you must draft a Firewater Grass core or a Fairy Dragon Steel core, or that fast electrics are a must for every draft, among other things. While this is helpful for new players who are not totally aware of the different things that Pokemon can do and what you need on a draft, this kind of thinking is kind of archaic, and to improve at drafting, I believe you must adapt your mindset from thinking about drafting with types in mind to drafting with roles in mind. Focus on having resist to important offensive typings like Fairy, Dragon, Ground, etc. Focus on getting good natural speed as well as good Scarfers or priority options so that you have ways to revenge opposing threats. Have pivots to enable your offense. And this is a role that is usually filled by a bunch of Pokemon, forming that fabled Volturn core that draft players love. And focus on physical and special bulk, so you're able to sponge hits on both sides of the spectrum. And of course, we cannot forget hazards. Having good setters and removal is always an important role to have in your checklist. You can even add roles based on your playstyle and preference, so you're not limited to the ones I mentioned on the screen. So to really nail down this point I'm trying to make, I'm going to take inspiration from False Swipe Gaming, and I'm going to use Cobalian as an example, and thus aptly call this the Cobalian Theorem. Personally, I've been a very big Cobalian hater in the past, and I've been pretty vocal about it. And my main reasoning behind this was that a steel type that doesn't resist Psychic or Fairy is essentially not a steel type. And I know a lot of people shared this view that Cobalian is not him. But let's just put all that aside and let's look at Cobalian's strengths, right? It has good physical bulk, making it an excellent switch into dark types, ice, and dragon types. On the physical side at least, it can set rocks, it can taunt, it can volt switch, all very valuable tools to have. It can set up with sword stance or a calm mind, and it can rock polish to boost speed, which is pretty cool. It has a very good speed tier of base 108, which enables it to be a reliable Scarfer. Sort of, mostly because the speed tier is good for a Scarfer, but its damage output off the bat is a little low, which is why I'm saying ish, because, you know, you might not kill things if they're not in range. But now let's look at its weaknesses. What Cobalian does not excel at is resisting Fairy or Psychic. It is not a breaker, unlike most high-tier fighting types. It also does not have knockoff, which can be detrimental for sure. And its initial damage output is pretty low, which also obviously does not help its case. So, how do we use this knowledge when it comes to drafting? If your draft needs a good rocker that is fast, that can pivot, that can set up, and it needs a good dark resist, Cobalian's a very good option to have because it fits all those roles. But if your draft is lacking a fairy resist and also lacking a steel, which is why you're looking at steel types, then Cobalian's not the guy for you because he does not resist fairy, so he does not fill that role. And if you draft it as your steel and don't make up for it, your draft would still be missing a key resistance to fairy. And given how strong of a typing fairy is, that's already putting your draft on the back foot. So the decision on what kind of Pokemon you should be drafting should depend on the kind of role you're looking to fulfill and not necessarily the typing of the Pokemon. Moving on, the next tip is to adapt your drafting, prep, and battling style according to the meta. What worked for you in an older generation may not work for you in the current meta. There's always the cursed power creep, which introduces new threats to the meta to worry about, as well as making some older threats not as good anymore. There are also some Pokemon that get a new lease of life and get better due to introduction of new items or moves or mechanics, or even just with a small change to a move pool. To always stay on top of the game, you need to account and adapt to these changes rather than complain and, about the good old days. One of the best skills a draft player can have is to be flexible and adapt as needed. Also, as an additional tip, pay special attention to the rare commodities during drafting. What I mean by this, for example, is in Scarlet and Violet, good removal is pretty limited. As such, it's something you should either prioritize because of the value of having good removal, or like the Pokemon that are good at it, or you draft in a way to ensure you're able to handle not having good removal of your own by either drafting a very offensive team or a team that's not necessarily weak to hazards. So yeah, similarly, Sword and Shield has an issue with good natural speed options. And to use a personal example, I don't really like the mid-tier speed options like the Noivern and the Talonflame. And what I do like is the Crobat. So if I feel like I don't have a good speed option, I try to grab Crobat earlier than some people would, just to make up for the fact that I don't like the other options, and it's a rare commodity. So again, to build on this point, I'm gonna use another Swords of Justice member, this time Keldeo, and talk about the Keldeo Theorem. Now, Keldeo used to be a menace in good old Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. It excelled as both a Revenger and a Breaker. Hazards were really strong in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, and coupled with the 1/8 burn damage, or 12.5%, which it was able to easily fish for with Scald, it made Keldeo a real nuisance to deal with. Would-be checked struggled to switch in safely due to multiple layers of hazards, plus burn damage, and even those with reliable recovery like the Laddie twins or the Slow twins were prone to being pursuit trapped. So this let Keldeo run rampant in Oras, and it is a very strong round to pick. So what happened? Come the new generation, Keldeo fell off hard. First of all, hazard removal options became significantly better, which made it harder to get Pokemon in range of Keldeo, especially on the Scarf set. On top of that, burn damage was nerfed to 116, or 6.25%, I believe, which compounded the problem that not enough chip was being acquired for Keldeo endgames. New additions like Toxapex and Tapu Fini walled both stabs of Keldeo while not being pursuit weak, making life harder for Keldeo. Even the addition of Flip Turn in Sword and Shield, which gave Keldeo a pretty special niche as a special attacking fighting type that could pivot, was not able to help it reach the levels of Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire. Power creep meant it had to compete with the likes of Urshifu, and it was also weak to threats to the meta like Tapu Koko and Rillaboom. This is a pretty good example of how meta changes were not kind to a former behemoth. Moving on to our next tip, this is something I see a lot of new players do, especially in team tours, and that is assuming information. Assuming information is definitely something you don't want to be doing if you want to improve at the game. This pertains to both movesets of Pokemon as well as items. One of the most common examples is assuming a Pokemon that is weak to rocks will be having heavy-duty boots. Obviously, you could and should actually have a likely item and moveset in mind for any Pokemon, but remember, your opponent has a different perspective of the matchup than you. They may not see it the same way, so what you may expect might be something they did not even consider. If you think a certain Pokemon has to be checked for one of your threats, but your opponent did not send it out, then you should take note of that and be on the lookout for lures or something unorthodox to catch you off guard. This is Draft League after all, where creativity thrives and shines. Not assuming information is how you don't lose to resist berries, unexpected scarfers, and so on. This one is situational and depends on the matchup a decent amount, but my next tip is to not throw away your Pokemon unnecessarily. They could be important for the endgame, especially if the Pokemon has a valuable immunity. Also, I've seen examples of players thinking they have to stay in after they have set up with a Pokemon, and that is not the case. If your opponent made a hard read or an unexpected play as you set up, and now is not the best opportunity to go ahead with the plan of your setup Pokemon, you can swap out and preserve it and come back later. You can get more chip or information needed and find an opportunity again to do the same thing. You're not forced to stay in, to reiterate. This also does not mean that maybe attacking first is better. It's all situational and depends on the game situation. If you have a free turn to set up, go for it. Maybe your opponent will make a mistake and let you set up, and then maybe you just win the game outright. But if you're not sure you win just yet or don't have the information about the item or set, it is perfectly okay to scout for it. Unless, of course, you win with another Pokemon, in which case it's a totally different scenario. Also, saving low HP sack pieces is potentially nice for the endgame, so that you can sack these Pokemon and bring in your other healthy Pokemon that can be threats safely. Next tip focuses on team building. An important aspect of prep is the ability to handle opposing threats. It is not always possible to check every threat defensively, so you need to be able to revenge the opposing threats. There's a reason why Scale Shot Garchomp is one of the best Pokemon allowed in Sword and Shield, because it can boost its attack and speed and become just snowball, right? Threats that can speed boost can turn a game around very, very easily, even if you have great natural speed of your own. I've seen many games where players do not have enough options to deal with such threats. Scarfers that outspeed, strong priority, booster energy speed in Scarlet and Violet, Pokemon with the ability Speed Boost or Unburden are some ways to have speed control versus opposing fast threats. Of course, Unaware in status can definitely help with dealing with opposing threats, but there are ways around both, especially in a draft setting with prep where you know what could potentially come. There are options like Taunt, Encore, Substitute, or just plain hacks messing up with the more passive approach of Unaware and status, which is why I say it's not always reliable. Next up, this is another common trend I've seen among draft players. Now, I'm going to assume that everyone knows the basics of how to EV your Pokemon, so we will not cover things like speed creeps and optimal HP number and optimal nature and so on. So, back to the topic on hand. I've seen a lot of draft players just slide the slider to the max value without really putting much effort or thought into it. Personally, I've asked a couple of my teammates on why they're running max attack on a certain Pokemon, and the replies I usually get are along the lines of, "Oh, just in case, or it might come into play, you never know." But we are draft players, we can't know, we can prepare for this, we can do better, right? We can EV to live certain hits, have just enough attack needed for the KO on the opposing Pokemon, and so on. EVing properly has a lot of value, especially for the high base stat total mons like legendaries and the pseudo legendaries and the mythicals and so on. Oops. For example, something with a monstrous attack stat like Kyurem Black doesn't need to be max attack all the time. If invested properly in its defenses, Kyurem can shrug off super effective hits while still nabbing the KOs, which is pretty vital. It opens up a lot of possibilities in the builder for sure. Another thing to note is to make sure the defensive check is really a check and is able to live the hits you think it does. I've seen cases where people switch in their check and they take hazards and this was not something they counted for, and suddenly the Pokemon trying to be a check is not really a check. So thinking about potential damage you might take is important while EVing for particular scenarios as well. Not just for defensive checks, but also for setup sweepers on being able to take a hit and still living to boost, for example. Finally, to tip number 7. Since draft is a format where prep has as much weight, if not more, as in-game play, we can use this and plan our opening turn and sequences in advance. We want to be able to make our opponent dance to our tunes and ensure that our game plan goes off smoothly and that we're not playing the opponent's game plan. A well-planned turn 1 can help you gain an early advantage and put you on the front foot right away. Since most draft teams usually have rosters between 8 to 12 Pokemon, it is always possible to have a dedicated lead based on the 6 you might see, as well as a dedicated turn 1 play based on what the opponent leads with. It is definitely a bit of time investment in prep, but to me it is worth it, especially for important games like team tours or playoffs. It can help calm the nerves a little because you know what you're going to be clicking already and have a game plan in mind. Without getting too deep into it, Pokemon is essentially a very simple game, and at any given turn, you and your opponent both have the choice of clicking one of 4 moves with the Pokemon on the field, or switching out to one of your remaining Pokemon. That's not a lot of combinations to worry about. So, Following your game plan also helps you get useful information about the opponent's plan and how they plan to deal with your game plan. And this is very useful in figuring out your win condition for your own endgame. Building on from the last tip, we can dive deeper and prep with potential sequences in mind as well. Think about what the most likely response will be for a Pokemon on your team. Does it force a swap, for example? And if so, what is the most likely swap in? Thinking about this can help you prepare sets that take advantages of these sequences. You will often see players setting up as the opponent switches out, and this could be one of the reasons why. You can use this to identify the positioning needed to set up with your Pokemon, and it can also help out iron out the details of your own endgame, knowing the conditions that you would need to win. This can also help you in coming up with heat techs. Shoutouts King L5 for the sub roleplay Victini. Basically, the scenario in that situation was that there was a Corviknight and we go Victini on it, and we know that Corviknight is forced out and Vaporeon's going to be the likely switch in. So you sub as the Vaporeon comes in and click roleplay, and now the Vaporeon's walled. There you go, you have a heat tech, right? And lastly, bit of a niche thing because I'm not sure how many players attempt to condition opponents, but you can definitely use the knowledge gained from thinking about potential sequences to condition your opponent into making plays that you want as well. I wasn't sure if this is something everybody knew, so I included it anyways just to be safe, and that is to pay attention to the in-game info being revealed to you every turn. It can definitely be helpful to identify spreads and speeds, especially if you're worried about a certain set. The revealed items, abilities, and moves could help you in identifying if your opponent indeed has that set. Knowing something has boots or leftovers, for example, is a good way of eliminating boosting item, choice scarf, focus sash, custard berry, resist berries, and so on. Pay special attention to the order of abilities activating, who swaps out first on a double swap out, who takes weather damage first, who gets recovery first, and so on. Because all these help you determine the speed of the Pokemon on the field, which is always crucial. We always want to be moving first, right? Have the speed advantage. So definitely take note of that. This, in conjunction with the damage done, can be useful in making educated guesses about the bulk, attack investment, and speed of the opposing Pokemon. As I said, this is probably basics for a lot of people, but I felt like including it couldn't hurt, so here we are. This is probably the most controversial take I have on here, but this is something I believe in, so here it is. I firmly believe that good players try to minimize predictions, or read as draft players call it. Paolo Maldini, one of the world's best defenders in football, or soccer for the North American audience, once said that if he has to make a tackle, he has already made a mistake. Along similar lines, I think to improve as a draft player, you should try to minimize risks that you need to take and only make them when the game calls for it. These scenarios are when you are behind in the game and need to do something to come back and have a chance, or it is a really tough matchup, for example. It is also probably okay if you really know the opponent well. I will concede that it depends on the build and playing style, and more offensive builds with little switch-ins probably rely more on getting predictions right. But I would still like to offer the advice of learning how to make mid-ground plays. I believe the better you get at making mid-ground plays, the more consistent you will be and be able to win against different playstyles, drafts, and so on. That being said, I would like to point out that making reads and predictions does not make you a bad player. That is not what I'm saying at all, so keep that in mind. Another one that might upset some people, but definitely not as controversial, at least in my eyes, is the fact that I believe no matchup is ever 100-0. If it was, there's no point playing that game at all. Just forfeit, if I'm being honest. You have to believe every matchup is winnable once. Cope for a bit before prepping if needed, get it all out of the system, but once you get into it, you have to be confident you can overcome the matchup. Think outside the box if your usual style is not working out. You could go hyper offense, for example, or completely on the other side of the spectrum and toxic stall. You could go for screens plus setup spam, or some cheeky yellow magic shenanigans. After all, when in doubt, click Thunderwave, right guys? Get help from your friends, maybe. Maybe even ask them to build. Just don't give up. Just keep swimming, as Dory would say. Next tip. I cannot stress this enough, but trying to win the game is more important than damage limitation in most cases. The only time it is okay to go for damage limitation is if you're playing in a league or tour and the differential might cost you a spot in the next route. In that case, trying to save differential is acceptable, but in almost every other scenario, winning should be the goal always, not saving differential. There's no difference in a 0-4 loss or 0-1 loss to me. It also does not really tell the story of the game. It could have been a very close game, but the scoreline may not reflect that, and that's okay. So go for the winning play, make the read if you have to. Yes, this is one of those cases where making predictions is okay. I'm not being a hypocrite, okay? Bank on your opponent making a mistake. Hope for hacks. Basically, give yourself the best chance of winning always. If the only way for you to win is to go into a certain mon and hope it crits, go for it first rather than resigning yourself to your fate and sacking everything and then realizing, oh, it killed and I maybe had a shot if I did that right away. This is actually a pet peeve of mine in team tours. If someone doesn't make the play they had to win because it will look embarrassing, or if it didn't come off, the loss would be big. Who cares? It's just a game at the end of the day. We can shake it off and move on. The last tip I have is a two-parter. I know most people know what a win condition is, or a win con for shot, sure, but I kind of need to explain it to talk about the second part of this pointer. So without much further ado, let's jump into the first part. We'll start with what a win con or win condition really is. It is basically the conditions needed for you to win the endgame. Now, how you win can be achieved in a variety of ways. It could be a setup sweeper, it could be a scurfer cleaning up, it could be stalling out toxic damage, and so on. There's no guaranteed one clear way of this must be a win con. Ideally, you should be thinking about how to win the game every turn, starting from turn 0, like before you've sent out your leads. But it is more realistic to start thinking about it towards the end game, when you have a better knowledge of opposing sets and have more information to work with. You want to eliminate as many variables as possible so that you have a clearer picture of what you need for the end game. This is why I stressed a lot on why getting information about the opponent's team is important. An important thing to consider as well is factors outside of your control while analyzing your win condition. This includes the good old hacks and mistakes made by the opponent. Hacks can ruin any path to victory, so if you have a safe 100% win path, go for it. No point crying hacks, even if it was only a small chance for it to happen, if you had a better path to victory, right? Again, I know this is probably common sense and part of basics, but it is very important to know and think about if you want to improve a Pokemon. Moving on to the second part of the tip. This is the whole reason I decided to make the video. This is to date the best advice I have ever gotten since I started playing Draft, and keeping this in mind has made me a better player, and I thought it was only fair that I shared it with everybody else. So let's jump into it. One of my friends, who has a crazy good record versus me by the way, he's really good, told me this when I asked him how to get better because he would continuously keep beating me, and he told me, think about your win con every turn, but also think about your lose con every turn. Obviously, at first, I didn't get it. Why would I think about ways I could lose the game when I'm trying to win the game? But look at it from your opponent's point of view for a second, right? They're trying to win the game as well and thinking about their own win con and what they need. So knowing how you can lose a game gives you insight into the potential plays of your opponent and how they're trying to win the game. And I think the best thing about this is it gives you even more information to work with, especially for the cursed 50-50s. There's a good possibility it leads you to the realization that what you thought was a true 50-50 is not a 50-50 at all because you hadn't considered your opponent's win path. This knowledge can help you refine your endgame positioning and sequences and hopefully give you a clearer path to victory. This advice has helped me a lot and has stuck with me throughout all these years, so now I decided to share it with y'all. So hopefully this helps you too, like it helped me. That's all I have for now. Thank you for so much for listening to me talk and talk. Hopefully it was worth your time and you learned something. Let me know if I missed something you think is important, or if you strongly agree or strongly disagree with something I've said. I appreciate all constructive feedback as always. Thanks, and I will see you next time. Bye!